Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, name is Abitonistim. IDSF is a leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Thank you to all our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Asher Fredman. Asher, thanks so much for joining.
It's fantastic to be here, and thank you, Moshe. Thank you to the Bitchonistim for having me again. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Asher, before you start, I want to tell everyone who you are. I know you've been on the briefing before, so many of your viewers are probably familiar with your work, but it's very important that they understand your credentials. Asher Fredman is the Executive Director of the Miskab Institute for National Security and the Director for Israel of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. So Asher, why don't we begin? You are the expert on the Abraham Accords. Why don't we begin with better clarity on the state of the Abraham Accords and how that fits into this big puzzle of the war here in Israel?
Absolutely. In a sense, what I think we've seen over the last few days is the rise once again of the interest or of the discourse about the Abraham Accords and about the potential of regional cooperation. We see that, for example, in the Republican Party's 2024 platform, which was approved at the Republican National Convention, which states that the Republican Party will stand with Israel and we will rebuild our alliance network in the region, in the Middle East, to ensure a future of peace, stability, and prosperity. So putting this vision of regional cooperation in a major element of their Middle East international policy. And it was presented very prominently in one of the very first interviews that the Republican vice presidential nominee, Senator J.D. Vance, gave soon after he was nominated. And I'll just quote his remarks. He said, starting out with Iran, he said, "If you're going to punch the Iranians, punch them hard." And that's what President Trump, did when he took out Soleimani. And then he said maybe the most important diplomatic breakthrough of the first Trump administration was the Abraham Accords. And if you want to check Iran, the way you do it is, first of all, cutting off their oil money. And secondly, by enabling the Israelis and the Sunni Arab states to work together and provide a counterbalance to Iran. And what I think we've seen here, consistently from Vice President nominee Vance and others, is the understanding that the Abraham Accords and regional cooperation are vital to the future of the region, are vital to countering Iran, and are very important within the context of an America First foreign policy. Vice President nominee Vance gave a speech recently in May at the Quincy Institute, which is certainly more of an, I don't call it an isolationist, but you could call it an isolationist leaning policy center. And he emphasized that while he, like other members of the Republican Party, have reservations about ongoing aid to Ukraine, and not going into the question now, the pros and cons of aid to Ukraine, nevertheless, they strongly support Israel, they strongly support the US-Israel alliance, and they strongly support regional cooperation as part of their America First worldview, and that the two should not necessarily be conflated. And if I may, I just want to quote a couple of lines from his remarks, which I thought were very particularly important. In these remarks that he gave in May, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want of our Israeli allies? And more importantly, what do we want of our allies writ large? Do we want clients who depend on us, who can't do anything without us? Or do we want real allies who can actually advance their interests on their own, with America playing a leadership role? And he went on to talk about Israel's technological leadership, its role in missile defense and missile defense parity. And I think very much the understanding here that regional security cooperation between Israel and the moderate Sunni states, the Abraham Accord states, Saudi Arabia, can be a game changer in terms of promoting regional stability and in terms of countering the regional instability and the terror being promoted by Iran. President Biden also, in an interview that I did, I believe yesterday, also highlighted the continued interest of the Saudis in establishing relations with Israel in turn for receiving American assistance in the military sphere, in the civilian nuclear sphere. So the regional cooperation element has, I would say, gone back on the table. And the benefits of regional cooperation, also from an American first perspective, are not limited just to the security sphere. In terms of trade, creating a regional trade corridor stretching from India via the Middle East to Europe, a Western Alliance corridor, would be an incredibly powerful economic force that would serve as an alternative, for example, to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative into the Iranian-Russian North-South corridor. The potential, much of the great power competition that we'll see in the coming years will be very much about technology, about AI, about quantum computing, about the nexus between technology and security. And American, Israeli, Middle Eastern, Abraham Accords cooperation can be a paradigm-shifting force in developing the advanced technologies to ensure continued American and Western leadership vis-a-vis this axis of Russia, China, and Iran. In terms of what we're actually seeing, the Abraham Accords Peace Institute did a recent analysis of trade data in the first 5 months of 2024 as compared to the first 5 months of 2023. So following the war as opposed to before the war, we found that trade with all of Israel's Abraham Accords partners is up. I believe trade with the UAE is up 8%. With Morocco, I believe it's 59%. With Egypt, if I recall correctly, 63%. With Bahrain, it's up something like 933%. Again, we're talking year over year, first 5 months of 2024 as compared to 2023. So what we're seeing is that the economic ties continue to be strong. The diplomatic, the strategic ties continue to be strong. We've seen, unfortunately, a reduction in the warm people-to-people public peace, certainly as a result of very negative public opinion in the Arab world and very negative depictions of Israel in the Arab media, including, unfortunately, in the Abraham Accords countries as well. On the other hand, we've seen some important cultural events, important interreligious events. The Misgav Institute here in Jerusalem just hosted a wonderful delegation of young Moroccan leaders who had come to Israel just this past week. The head of the Misgav Institute, Mayor Ben Shabbat, speaks Moroccan Arabic, so there was a very lively exchange, and they were, of course, very supportive of Israel's fight against terror. Whoever the next administration is, whoever wins the elections in November, it's going to be critical to restart the momentum for regional cooperation, regional integration, Abraham Accords, and that's going to take emphasis on multilateral initiatives, like, as I mentioned, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, the IMEC corridor, Middle East defense architecture, air defense, maritime, cyber. It's going to also take a lot of investment and involvement from our American allies, from European allies, from partners and allies in Asia who also strongly support Abraham Accords and regional cooperation as being in line with their own interests. But if and when that all happens, I am optimistic. Of course, it will require also Israel to achieve victory in Gaza, because as long as if Israel ends the war and Hamas, the Sinwar, Hamas comes out waving the victory sign, that is not only going to inspire Iran and all of the terrorist groups, whether they're Iranian proxies or jihadist groups or Muslim Brotherhood groups in the region, to continue carrying out their wave of attacks. It's also going to signal to all of our regional partners and potential partners that Israel was not capable of achieving its defined war goals of defeating a terrorist organization in a territory whose borders it controls entirely, whose airspace and waters it controls entirely. So that is also going to be an important element in creating the conditions for renewing the momentum on regional cooperation. I think I'll stop here and open it up to questions.
Asher, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, and our viewers have a lot of questions. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers who either send in the questions in the Zoom chat or who email or message them to me. Asher, you mentioned the American First policy. So here's the question. For Americans who are staunchly America First, why support Israel? Is Israel a liability? Is Israel an asset? What would you say to people who really believe in that policy?
What I would say, and I think this is also what Vice Presidential nominee Vance articulated well in his remarks several months ago, is that Israel is actually a critical component of an America First policy, whether it's with regards to trade, whether it's regards to American technological superiority, whether it is with regards to enabling America's allies and partners here in the Middle East, empowering them to cooperate and to defend themselves by themselves with American leadership and guidance, but using their own capabilities and their leveraging their cooperation to counter Iran. And that will, over time, also allow the shift of American assets. It'll help defend American interests and assets in the Middle East, and allow the shifting of those assets to other regions and other theaters, such as East Asia. The American-Israeli cooperation on missile defense, on counter-drone technology, on cyber will be critical for empowering, assisting America in countering the threats that it'll face from China. And Israel's role in building this regional alignment, whether it's with countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, whether it's with countries like India, even countries like Taiwan, for example, will be critical for creating America-aligned frameworks and platforms in the region and in the broader region.
Now, here in Israel, there are many who believe that Israel needs to invest in its own defense industry. Certainly within IDSF, many of our leadership believe that. I'm curious, again, in this America First framework, to what extent would the U.S. require Israel to continue spending its foreign aid back in the U.S., or is there a possibility of, with a new government, that money being spent in Israel?
I think, and this is a very good question, and it also goes to the need for critical thinking about the next 10-year MOU. As you know, the U.S.-Israel Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2018 is up in 2028, and will have to start being discussed again whenever the new administration comes into office in January. And there certainly will be those voices in Israel who will just say, we want to have as much money from America as possible. We want to continue buying as many expensive high-tech systems from America as possible. Let's sort of remain as dependent on America as possible. I think that within the America First framework, that actually creates room to discuss how does America empower Israel in terms of developing its own domestic industry. That could be done also by American companies. In Israel, because of the global shortage of defense equipment, of munitions, there could be an arrangement where some of the production being done in Israel, it also goes towards American stockpiles. So I think actually that within America, again, these are all complicated issues that need to be worked out on the economic perspective as well. But I think two things, the bottom line is, one, Israel needs to think critically about what it wants for the next MOU and how it moves from a more dependent to a more independent and mutually beneficial relationship with our American strategic allies. And secondly, how can we leverage Israel's the development of a more independent Israel in the context of an America First policy, which wants obviously to benefit American military power, but also wants its regional allies to be able to sort of handle their own problems by themselves in order to free up the United States to focus on other pressing challenges.
Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Saudi Arabia. What can you tell us about Saudi Arabia in terms of their demands for a recognized Palestinian state, and in terms of the possibilities of them being involved in a post-war Gaza?
It was interesting. In President Biden's recent interview, he actually didn't mention a Saudi request for steps related to the Palestinians when he talked about Saudi's continued interest in normalization with Israel in return for what the Americans can give them. Now, I don't know if that was intentional or unintentional. I do believe the Saudis continue to be primarily concerned or primarily interested in the benefits they can get from the United States. I do think that the Saudis would like or would require an Israeli recognition of a pathway towards the Palestinian state. I think that that's actually less of an obstacle. I think that certainly under a Republican administration, but under whatever administration ends up in office, that could be worked out, the kind of language that would nevertheless make clear that the Palestinian Authority in its current form is not a partner for peace. And I think that the Sunni states understand that probably better than most people in Europe, possibly some people in the United States. A Saudi insistence on a end to the operation in Gaza would be a more challenging condition, although the high intensity warfare does appear to be winding down in any case. In regards to potential Saudi involvement or Emirati involvement in Gaza on the day after, it is possible, I believe, if and when Hamas is fully defeated as a military and governing force, not as an ideology. You can't defeat an ideology, but you can eliminate 75% of their fighting force, 75% of their leadership. Now, why is that? The Emiratis, the Saudis know Hamas very well. They are going to have very little interest in being involved in the governance or in the management of Gaza with Hamas still running around, still the de facto dominant power on the ground. If and when Hamas is defeated and a vacuum is created that allows other factions, other forces, other entities to play a role, because again, nobody in Gaza, even those who oppose Hamas, are not going to do anything as long as they fear that Hamas will end up in their living rooms and execute them the next day. So they're all waiting also to see if Hamas will in fact be defeated. In such a situation, we could see either Saudi or Emirati involvement, I believe. And we should also recall both the Saudis over the last few years and the Emiratis in the past decades have led very impressive processes of, I would say, de-radicalization or promoting the values of tolerance and dialogue within their educational systems, within their judicial systems. In Saudi Arabia, it's still an ongoing process, but also they've made great strides over the last few years. And their involvement in a de-radicalization of Gaza could be extremely beneficial in creating the conditions for a peaceful and stable and thriving entity in the Gaza Strip.
Just if I could focus on this point for a second, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, like tachlis, as we say in Israel, the bottom line is, what are their interests in Gaza? Do they need a stable Gaza for their own country's business interests? Is it about security in the region? Is it about bringing emancipation to the people of Gaza? Like, at the end of the day, what do they really care about?
I would say there are three elements here. One is, while they have no illusions about Hamas or about the Palestinian Authority, they are truly sympathetic and supportive of the Palestinian people. And insofar as they could promote the well-being and the stability and the prosperity of the Palestinian people, that is something that is important to them and certainly to much of their population. Secondly, it's very important, certainly for Saudi Arabia and its Vision 2030, from an economic perspective. Saudi Arabia, in order to develop the province of Neom, which is quite close to Israel, you can literally see the province from Eilat, is, in order to attract massive foreign direct investment, in order to develop these mega projects, requires regional stability. And regional integration, regional economic cooperation, regional technological cooperation would be a great boon to their goals of developing and diversifying their economy and advancing these mega projects. So that would be a very strong interest in seeing a peaceful and prosperous Gaza that would also help lead to a peaceful and prosperous region. Thirdly, Gaza is probably maybe the first example of a state run according to the principles of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you had other Muslim Brotherhood leaders like Morsi in Egypt, but Egypt under Morsi wasn't run according to the principles of the Muslim Brotherhood. Gaza under Hamas was. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is an arch enemy of the Saudi leadership, of the Emirati leadership, the leaderships that value tolerance as opposed to extremism. The defeat, the downfall of the first Muslim Brotherhood state would send a clear message to the entire region that this path, the Muslim Brotherhood path, is not a viable path and leads to destruction. But again, to be honest, I think they would like to see an Israeli victory as quickly as possible, and they are not happy that due to various pressures, the operation is taking so long.
Okay, we're going to switch topics again, and I want to hear your thoughts on a hostage deal with Hamas. I'm sure you have researched this extensively, what the implications could be, what the red lines are. So Tell me what your thoughts are.
Absolutely. The problem has been that within the Israeli discourse, it's been very, I would say, shallow or very uh, flat. We have to put it, as difficult as it is, we have to put the facts on the table, and then the leadership, the Israeli leadership, has to make a decision in this terrible dilemma. But it has to be done without the illusions and the false paradigms and the conceptiot that led us to October 7th. On the one hand, according to the deal that's currently being discussed, there is a good chance that we will be able to bring 30, 40, nobody knows exactly, but 30, 40, maybe more living hostages back home. And that is an incredibly wholly important mission. On the other hand, we have to recognize that A, this will be a strategic defeat for Israel. That whatever stories the military leadership is telling the media, when Sinwar comes out waving his fingers in the victory sign, that image will be blast around the Arab and Muslim world in a second. It will inspire waves of terror attacks from all of Israel's borders and from all of the regional terror organizations surrounding Israel. It will make Israel, as I mentioned, look weak to potential partners. It will impact, obviously, the families of the fallen soldiers who may feel that their sons or daughters fell in vain. If Israel leaves the Philadelphia corridor and once again relies on Egypt, international forces, technology to secure the border, we will rapidly see Hamas rearming. Again, as Hamas, what Hamas will do is it will drag on negotiations for the second round, the third round. It will insist on reconstruction. There will be massive international pressure to allow in cement and wiring and fiberglass. Hamas will rebuild its capabilities, and we will see once again deadly attacks on Israel's southern periphery. I also, tragically, don't believe from just a realist analysis that Hamas will ever free all of the hostages. Its interest will always be to keep some of those hostages as insurance, the way they've held on to Hadar Golden and Oren Shaul and the two civil and Avram Mengistu and Avesh Mengistu and Hisham Asayid for a very long time. Again, this is a terrible dilemma. All of the costs versus the benefit of bringing 30 to 40 of our fellow sisters and brothers, sons and daughters home. And the job of leadership is to make those terrible, difficult decisions. But we must not tell ourselves stories that will stop the fighting and we'll just start again, right? The international community, the internal pressure will not allow us to start again. To say, well, we won't allow armed terrorists to go back to Gaza's north. Well, of course, they won't be armed. They'll just go back to Gaza's north and pull out their weapons that are hidden under the bed and hidden under the ground. So what I'm just hoping for and calling for is an honest dialogue in order to make this difficult decision that faces Israel.
Asher, thank you for sharing all that. There's really a lot to think about. I want to kind of focus on that idea of a strategic defeat, that if Israel makes a deal with Hamas for hostages, you say, it signifies a strategic defeat and can have broader implications. So if we just look at the war so far, is there indication that the times that Israel made a deal and got out hostages, there were repercussions in the region, that there was an uptick in concerns of increased terrorism? Meaning, what's the basis for that idea that if we make a deal, more bad things will happen?
The basis, I mean, are you referring to previous hostage deals like Hanan Tannenbaum or the
Correct. Meaning any hostage deals, have we seen copycat incidents thereafter? Meaning you're saying that if we make a hostage deal now, it will have a strategic defeat. Is there a history to show that is in fact the case?
And what we saw in the previous cases is that we demonstrated to the terrorist organizations that taking hostages is a very good idea, right? The conclusion which Hamas reached after kidnapping Gilad Shalit and the Gilad Shalit deal is taking hostages is a really, really good idea. Let's plan a massive October 7th attack and let's take lots of hostages. The difference here is that Israel has said, the war cabinet, the prime minister has said, actually the security cabinet has said, our goal is to defeat Hamas as a governing and military entity and to free all of the hostages. Now, Gaza is a territory with about 30 to 40,000 terrorist fighters, maybe about another 20,000 armed individuals connected to Hamas, police officers, etc. It's a territory which Israel, as I mentioned, controls all of its borders, controls its airspace, controls its water. If Israel, with all of its military might, fails to achieve these goals, and it honestly doesn't matter the fact that there's a huge amount of rubble in Gaza and that much of the cities have been destroyed. Sinwar will come out, declare victory, whether or not Defner has been killed or not, and he will tell the people of Gaza, look, true, your houses that were built in the 1970s were destroyed. Don't worry, soon there's going to be reconstruction, and you'll have the latest model smart houses, and we'll rebuild. And whether it's Western or Qatari funding or whoever pays for it. So I think that in this case, we've seen in the previous cases that it's inspired further attacks. And in this case, it will send a message to Iran, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to forces in Judea and Samaria, to forces that are looking to undermine Jordan, that the path of terror is a success. Sinwar is our greatest hero, and let's now replicate that kind of attacks. Now, again, you might argue that that's worth it, given the possibility of freeing some of the hostages, and freeing the young women, and freeing hopefully the Bibas children, and who knows who else. But we have to recognize the costs.
For sure. So if I understand you correctly, it's not that freeing hostages is the strategic defeat in your mind, as much as what the implications are, freeing hostages and ending a war and allowing Sinwar to live on. That whole puzzle together creates that strategic.
I think failing to achieve our declared war goals.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. I think that's a very important point to clarify. And I really thank you, Ashra, for taking my barrage of questions. This has been highly informative, very educational, much to think about. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for sending in your questions. And we're going to have to do this again, Asher. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much, Moshe.
Take care. To all of our viewers, we will be back tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.